So for the grooming that we talk about, who leads it, who participates in it, and who is a facilitator for a grooming session? Awais, do you want to kickstart that?
Yep. As Reha said, obviously has to be with the three amigos and the entire team. The Scrum Master usually will facilitate, and PO would be kind of leading the session. If the PO is not to be found, or if there are vacations, some unavailabilities, you need to have a proxy. If the proxy is not available, the Scrum Master can take up that role. If the stories are defined way ahead of time, it has been shared with the team, and the team understands what's the scope of the grooming. And there are times where the team would need several SMEs, probably from outside the team. So there is flexibility that you can invite SMEs or certain owners from outside just to be part of the grooming. To give the team better insights, better understanding of from a solution perspective, from a business perspective. Uh,
Yeah,
but definitely the entire Agile team should be a part of
perfect. All right. And Reha, let me ask you this question. Do you have any slicing techniques for user stories? Have you used some techniques personally, or you have examples to share with the audience here to demo how you can do better slicing?
I think the most common slicing technique, which a lot of spaces use for agile teams when it comes to the team level, is the Fibonacci, right? We're all aware of that. The Fibonacci is zero, this can't be zero, what, 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, and 13. The 8s and the 13s being where there are a lot of unknowns. So that's a very common sizing technique a lot of times teams use. Most of your planning poker cards are based upon that sizing technique too. One important thing to note about sizing techniques is they are relative, right? The sizing is supposed to be relative. And the goal of sizing is not accuracy. The goal of sizing is consistency. And what the difference is that if I were to pick a 2-point story up today, the sizing would be consistent with the 2-point story 3 sprints ago, right? So that's consistency. What we are not trying to do is compare sizing across teams. With SAFE, however, when teams or organizations go scaled, and you could be following any scaled agile methodology, whether it's SAFE or whether it's less or whether it's DAD or it's scale. Irrespective of the methodology, I think the sizing needs to become normalized, and it needs to become normalized across the portfolio or the art or the whatever the segment we're talking about. And the reason for that is you're trying to also do some capacity assumptions and capacity analysis at the higher level, at the scale level. And what the normalized sizing means is, for SAFE, for example, suggest you use 1 point one day, and then every other story, and then you find a story which would take you half a day of development and half a day of testing. So that's your 1-point story, and every other story should then be sized relative to that 1-point story. So you still stick with the relative sizing, but you normalize it. And the idea of normalization is that everybody's not running around in different directions with somebody's doing t-shirt sizing, somebody's doing Fibonacci, somebody's doing hours and days. But we're all at a normalized technique where we all agree that this is the technique we use. And of course, your one day could be different from my one day.
Yeah, absolutely. And then our next question falls into actually, this is a really good question. We have seen this, and I think I'm pretty sure everyone has seen this, is especially when the teams are starting new. They groom the story, they plan the story, they start executing it, and then the stories move from one sprint to another, right? So that is one of the anti-patterns. Oh, not an anti-pattern, but that becomes one of the challenges, right? A lot of teams deal with it differently, and that's where we fall into the anti-patterns. I think in the last part we discussed a little bit about it. So, Awais, what have you seen that with your teams where stories are moving from one sprint to another, and how do you deal with it, or how should the teams facing that challenge deal with it?
Yeah, definitely. When the teams start and we're moving from phase gate to agile, this is a very very common occurrence, and the teams face it, and the most of the brunt is faced by the executives. Uh, So one of the and it's a fairly common occurrence happening with the team. One of the biggest reasons that we have seen is again coming down to slicing the stories. So if the teams have 8 points or 13-point stories, and if the majority of the backlog is around it, right? Definitely, we know that these are bigger stories, complex stories, things which are unknown. Uh, so they tend to move from sprint to sprint, what we call dancing within the sprints, and to mitigate that, one of the some of the techniques that we use is, first of all, vertical slicing. So we set up agendas with the scrum masters, and this is how we coach the scrum masters: is uh, 3 iterations down the road, there should absolutely be no 8-point stories within the team, and
Yeah.
80% of the backlog should be between one, twos, and threes. Once those guardrails are set up, right? Because the smaller amount of stories we have, uh, the more the more prediction the more protection we can get, and the team is more comfortable, and hence we can build the trust even with the executives, because they know the predictability of how the team would be burning down for
Yeah.
the end. So again, slicing is a very important aspect of it. And as teams mature, they understand and they slice the story accordingly. Wherein there could be certain dependencies between stories, which is fine. But as a thumb rule, right? 13, if you're having a 2 week sprint, 13 is definitely not in question. Even 8-point stories could become our high risk stories.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Rhea, I'm gonna pivot this question to you. So, what Awais mentioned is a good way to prevent for story not to flow from one sprint to another. Now, if you see something like that happening, how like it now? Let's say you're in a situation where this has happened. How do you deal with that situation? Like, what do you do? What's the next step?
Um, Rahul, it's important that we do some problem solving around this, right? It's one of the things which happens with a lot of teams where stories spill over, and I think there could be a number of reasons. One could be either A, the team is not sizing stories correctly. The definition or the acceptance criteria is not clear. They are not slicing the stories correctly, like Awais had pointed out. So it's important to first take the teams through. That's something which I traditionally always do with teams, is to understand what's going on. And you should be setting up some problem solve sessions and start thinking of targeted states. So probably grooming is going to be a good place to start. Are we slicing the stories accurately? Slicing is important because the sizing of the story is not then going to depend on understanding what the ask is, right?
Yeah.
Typically, teams tend to view stories, or new teams which are coming into Agile, they're very used to a task level view, right? So we are
Yeah.
going to put in, we're going to request login credentials, then we're going to put in the database requests, then we're going to do DB mods, and we're going to do schema changes, and then we'll do the UI. So it's very task level project management way of handling the work, right? So visualization here is going to play the key, where the Scrum Master needs to work with the product owner to define better user stories. The other thing is going to be, like Awais suggested, when there are a lot of unknowns, you should be suggesting the team to do a lot of spikes early on, research spikes earlier on into the sprints, right?
Yeah.
If you're able to do that, because the result of spikes are usually stories. So when the unknowns become known, then that's when you put stories.
Mm-hmm.
Should be one important thing about spikes is you should be sizing your spikes. It's important to time box your spikes and say, okay, this is what we are intending to get out of the spike, and this is what we are going to run the spike for. And once this time box is over, we need to reiterate, regroup, and see how far did we get and what did we find out, right? And then start replanning your spikes. So introducing early spikes, looking at better ways of slicing user stories, and finally looking at whether you are overcommitting
Yeah.
and because you're under delivering. Those are going to be some of the things which you should be looking out for.
Yeah.
Master.
Great point, Rhea. About the spikes. I have absolutely seen this happening in teams who start to do spike stories. Is they keep going on with the spike because now they're just trying to find the answers, right? And it's very important for people who are listening to this. if you are using spikes, make sure you're time boxing it, because the time will get away from you, and then you won't be working on the prioritized list versus working on a spike. So, Reha and Awais, one of you take this question. Let's say you put a spike and you time box it for 2 days, right? If you don't get an answer after you regroup, there's nothing that you found. What do you do? What's the next step? Do you put another spike for the next sprint, or do you reprioritize at that time, and do you, after reprioritizing, see if you want to work on the spike versus a story? So how do you deal with that?
We'll go
So,
alphabetical. Always.
Always.
okay, that's a nice way. Uh, so again, it depends on what was the purpose of the spike. If the purpose of the spike was to find out different options for the solution itself, and what is the acceptance criteria for that spike? Are we trying out different solutions, or we are trying out just one solution, or we are the spike could be to go through the documentation and gather further information. So
Yeah.
when you're going through a spike, again even the spikes, one of the most important criteria is the acceptance criteria and documentation of it. If we are going in a stepwise architecture approach, right, and if the team has spent 2 or 3 days, and if they don't find the solution, they don't get through it, then probably go to the next solution, right? Jump on ahead. There could be a case wherein if you are doing documentation or doing research, you might not have done the entire research, but see what you have found out. So one of the acceptance criteria for spikes, which we encourage the teams to have, is a discussion within the team itself, documentation and discussion.
Yeah.
So at the end of the spike, whoever the owner of the story is, they would come in and sit with the team and explain to the team what were the findings, and the team usually takes it from there. So, but again, as you said, Rahul, one of the anti-patterns could be, hey, we had 2 days, we didn't found anything. Let's have another spike for 3 days and let's see what we can find. That is something that we should absolute kind of, avoid
Avoid.
to the
Yeah.
best of the ability, because again, then you'll end up with series of spike stories without any resolution.
Absolutely. Rhea, do you have anything to add to that?
My only 2 cents here would be that the Scrum Master does have an important role to play, Rahul, in this situation, which particularly you brought up when a team started a spike and the time box is over and the team realized they found nothing. So what do you do? This is one of the places where good facilitation skills should kick in. A good Scrum Master should have some tools up their sleeve around this. This is where your team needs to problem solve. Things like the Ishikawa diagram, which is a fishbone diagram, just kind of problem statements, right? What is the problem you're trying to solve through this spike? And then trying to put it in buckets, trying to find the root cause of the situation,
Yeah.
then figuring out target conditions. Because if a Scrum Master is stuck in a situation where you had a spike and the time box is over and you did nothing, or the team achieved nothing, clearly the ask is not clear, right? Or the team, or the solution, the proposed solution, which the team was thinking was the path they wanted to go around or to, is clearly not the correct path, or the intended path is not the actual path. So this is when problem solving should come in. Use tools. You've got the Johari window, you've got Ishikawa, you've got the 5 whys. Use these tools to facilitate discussions with your team and come up with a well-defined acceptance criteria for that next spike. Around prioritization, it depends on the product owner. How important is it to get it done? Usually spikes should be one sprint ahead of the stories, which they are coming to. So if that story truly is a priority for the next iteration, then of course the spike becomes a priority too.
Yeah, absolutely makes sense. And really good point again about having a spike, a sprint ahead. So try not to put your spike for the work within the sprint, because then you're just doing parallel activities. So it's basically researching while doing the work. So that sometimes becomes an anti-pattern. Great. All right. So one other question that we had from our audience from last time, but before I jump to that, we talked about story moving from one sprint to another, right? one of the questions people ask and teams ask the scrum master, and a lot of times new scrum master didn't know what to do about it, is do you carry all the points of the story to the next sprint? Or like in the last part, Awais mentioned one of the anti-patterns is if it was 5 point story and it's moving to the next sprint, most of the work is done. In the next sprint, they move the story and they call it a one pointer. So what do you do, Reha? How do you handle that situation? Do the story points move with it? Do the story points split or leave back the story points? How do you deal with it?